Hi everyone, my name is Maria Fernanda Valdaspinos, and I'll talk about cultural colonialism and new languages of power, scientific progress in the 19th century Ecuador by Gil Fitzwell. The Europeans in the natural science in the 19th century in Ecuador. Europeans traveled to the Ecuadorian Andes in 1809. These travelers came to Ecuador from Europe during a period of global expansion in industrial production and international trade, confident in their identity as agents of civilization and progress, intended to contribute professionally to the natural science with the purpose of classifying, measuring, and organizing natural space according to the scientific criteria. This paper focuses on whether Europeans' progressive ideas and scientific practices introduces new languages which altered the way Ecuadorians understood the organizations of their lives. Natural science in the physical space. Production and organization of physical space was a crucial problem in Ecuador. The modernization and progress with the concomitant demands for new roads, railways, postal services, sewage, lighting, and modern scientific institutions was really important for the country. Spain resulted in new conceptions of territory and new state power and means of governing this territory. Solution, production, and new organization of physical space. By the 1870s, a group of Europeans came to the Ecuador at the president's request, specifically to set up of scientific institutions, a polytechnical college to teach the practical applications of scientific methods such as road and bridge construction, a meteorological observatory, and a botanical garden. Cotopaxi volcano erupted in 1877 and became the focus of a challenge of the Roman Catholic Church culture hegemony in Ecuador, beginning a process which would eventually change the power structure of the republic. The larger issue at the stake was the relative authority of the Church and the state in national affairs, and the relationship, if any, which should exist between the two. As the state legitimation depended on arguments which coincided with the ideas and activities of European natural scientists concerning physical space, what follows is also a story of the ways in which different social groups in Ecuador legitimated or rejected the ideas and activities of the 19th century European scientists in the context of their own lives and immediate constraints. Politics and knowledge. There are two ways of analyzing the relationship between knowledge and power. We can put more attention on the different uses, practices, as well as the different writing and regarding meanings of textual claimings to knowledge, in order to find out how colonial discourses affected social and political relationships in particular historical circumstances. The first focuses on specific local history by asking who has a symbolic power, who creates and defines recognizes visions of that social world, and what ends. The second follows up with this question about the local control and distribution of knowledge, to connect local histories in wider historical relationships of cultural, social, political, and economical process. Hegemony is important in such an analysis, not to claim that hegemonic presentations are a conspiracy of absolute power to make lies appear as truths, But in order to question why the meaning attributed to certain kinds of facts makes more sense in particular historical circumstances to most, if not all, people. He test of successful cultural colonialism depends on the extent to which people accepted European science and in it on practice. A general, if not total, consensus regarding to the legitimacy of scientific ideas and practice would constitute a hegemonic, common-sense vision of the social world described by the language. This analytical focus included the possibility that European ideas and activities were ignored by many groups, and that they were recognized as authoritative forms of knowledge by others, but may have been appropriated for them. European culture and the Ecuadorian elite. In the 1870s, these Europeans that were visiting the Ecuador were mainly given intellectual support by a few individuals of the land-owning class, many of them whom have become educated in Europe and whose social relations with Europe travelers were the result, at least in part, of class interests. European travelers' acceptance in this regard was the result of historical conditions which already existed in the arrival after colonial independence in 1809. The influence which European travel gained through this small locus of support cannot measure in these size. By, by the landowner's powerful social standing as cannot measure by its size, but by the landowner's powerful social understanding as members of the pre-independence nobility and their influential involvement in the government. This powerful legitimization of their work and social standing ensured that Europeans could live in a comfort while in Quito while they stay in Quito, and would have the opportunity to influence the exchange of ideas with this social class. This perception of natural space and objectable phenomena was not common in Ecuador at the beginning of the 19th century, and Europe activities which involved exploring, surveying, and recording a natural environment were often viewed with suspicion. Objectification of nature in maps and geographical classification came to be a legitimate and emulated by some Ecuadorian intellectuals as means of construction and legitimating the objective boundaries of national identity. European science in the University of Quito. In the 19th century, Europeans in Ecuador were not the first to introduce science as a form of disciplinary knowledge. They continued the work begun from the 18th century by the Jesuit scholars by the French Scientific Commission in 1736 of teaching and practicing the disciplinary methods of natural science in Ecuador. Gabriel García Moreno, who was to become one of the most influential Ecuadorians of the 19th century, shared Jameson's concerns. Jameson's and mathematics by the French engineer Sébastien Weiss, who had been hired as government engineer in 1844 to supervise road construction, became a scientific associate of García Moreno. The two of them made expeditions to the volcanic crater of Richincha in 1844 and 1845, which was later acknowledged in international scientific circles when Humboldt referred to the expedition in Cosmos and translated the report to miscellaneous geology. Garcia Moreno went to Paris in 1855 to pursue the study of science, where he studied chemistry, mineralogy, and geology, and became a member of the French Geological Society in 1856. Returning to Ecuador, he became rector of University of Quito in the same year. In 1857, the State Congress, which Garcia Moreno and Aguirre passed legislation stating that the teaching of science was indispensable to the Republic progress. This legislation recommended the introduction of scientific instruction in 3 secondary schools, the institution of Faculty of Science in the University of Quito also was denegated from the law. Garcia Moreno and the State of Discipline. In 1861, Gabriel Garcia Moreno became acting president of the Republic after a year of civil war. The order or discipline which Fabre proposed for Ecuador appeared to be exactly what Garcia Moreno intended to carry out. Garcia Moreno began with the hierarchy of civil servants and their subordination to a centralized state of power. In 1861, while Garcia Moreno was acting as president, when Flores' absence, he passed 3 important laws intended to redefine and reclassify the territory of Ecuador, as well as a political and economical regulation. The Ley de División Territorial established a new province and several new cantons and parishes, dividing the national territory into smaller units, in order to facilitate political and municipal administration. The Ley de Régimen Político, defining the hierarchy of political and economic control within these territorial boundaries. The governor who resided in the capital of each province was to act as direct agent of the state executive power, and to ensure the order and security of the province, it's a political and economical governance and compliance with the constitution, the laws, and the order of the state. Each year an account was to be sent to the government of births, marriages, and deaths in each province, and every 4 years a census of the population was to carry out with the related data on agriculture and industry. Finally, la Ley de Régimen Municipal was to regulate the administration of common interest. Garcia Moreno and the Church. The Ley de Régimen Municipal worked against the traditional authority of the local clergy by appropriating their responsibility for the common goods. Garcia Moreno appeared to agree with the Fabre that it was necessary to work through the Roman Catholic Church to bring the spirit of institution from Europe. This activity, with regard to the Church, however, was extremely contradictory, despite his invest in scientific and economic progress. He attempted to establish a conservative concordat between the Vatican and Ecuador in 1863, which could give the Church ultimate authority over the government. Without claiming to explain fully Garcia Moreno's intention, there appear to have been 2 distinct strategies at work in his action. The first was to take away long-established local church powers concerning common interest and subsume them under the new authority of an independent state through the municipalities. The second was to reforge political ties in Europe through the Church with the help of his Vatican Concordat, through his introduction of modern spirit of institutions from Europe. European Protestants and the Catholic Church. This attitude partiality explains the Europe travelers' minimal connection with the Church before the 1870s. Until that time, the Europeans tended to describe thinkers apparently espousing no particular religious faith. Proponents of reasons rather than the superstition which they criticize uh, in the activities and beliefs of the local population. The clergy were undoubtedly accurate in interpreting the presence of European liberal thinkers in Ecuador as threat to the church. The fight that ensues was a power struggle between church authorities and government officials over the control of exclusionary spaces defined as church or government property. In 1866, Colonel Neil, the British Church Affairs, died suddenly in Quito, with a result of that practicing Protestant had to be buried in Ecuador for the first time in history. The government offered to bury Neil in a piece of state-owned property until his body could be taken to England. The diplomatic corps and, and the members of the Congress, an entire army garrison of Quito made up a funeral cortege, which crossed the city through crowds of interest boundaries. Unfortunately, as events turned out, although the burial site was government property of the only direct access to it through a Roman Catholic monastery, as the cortege approached the site, the bishop of Quito appeared with a group of monks to order not to burial in a Catholic cemetery. A state institution of scientific progress. The University of Quito was closed in 1869 for the imperfect teaching. In this event marked the beginning of new legitimation of science in Ecuador. The university reopened in 1870s with a new faculty of modern medicine in the addition of the Escuela Politécnica, which was to constitute a completely new faculty to teach mathematics, physics, chemistry, and natural science. Botany, zoology, geology, and mathematics were to be applied to the progress in Ecuador. Knowledge of nature would be basic on which to open new routes and new and to increase internal and international markets. Physics and engineering would contribute to the construction of machines needed to begin the modern progress. These European Jesuit scientists were given considerable symbolic power to impose their particular vision of the world in Quito. He became in they became in Jesuit priest in 1868, left the calling. This was Darwin. In 1874, Darwin made the evolutionary theory. He left the Escuela Politécnica and became a stage geologist, staying in Ecuador for more than 20 years as honorary citizen. He produces a map of Ecuador and a book of Geografía en Geología del Ecuador in 1892, which are still respected today, and provided technical direction to the installations of potable water in lightning in Guayaquil. Resistance for foreign and scientific discipline. Hegemonic claims must appeal to a wide range of other groups within the society and must be able to claim with at least some plausibility that their particular interests are those of society. Garcia Moreno was assassinated in 1875 and the Polytechnica closed a year after his death. The ruling class of Ecuador did not generally perceive that the Polytechnica to be their interest. Cover commented that this classical object to any form of manual work, that the students were not adequately prepared to the science school. and that because there was no real industry in the country, the purpose of scientific training was not clear to them. In November 1875, there was a popular demonstration in Guayaquil against the European Jesuits and in Quito a month later against the foreign religious communities. A volcanic eruption. This event occurred in June 26, 1877, with the unexpected eruption of Cotopaxi and the copious rain of dust and ashes which accompanied it, causing considerable havoc and damage of the areas of La Tacunga and Quito. The legitimacy of natural science was intrinsically involved to the ideological struggle which followed the volcanic eruption in 1877, and Luis Sodero and Theodore Wolff were chosen by the Ecuadorian government to bring the recognized scientific authority to bear this issue. The eruption of Cotopaxi was the last in a series of events which brought the President Ventimiglia and members of the Church in an outrighting of public contempt for common sense legitimation by the local populace. Their issue contest was whether the Church or the State had the authority to determine the interpretation of events, and ultimately which had the greatest authority in Ecuador. He forbade freedom of religion and condemned the theological mistakes, which included liberty of press, freedom of individual conscience, freedom of worship, and separation of church and state, describing these as depraved, false, perceived, and detestable opinions. The competition for the interpretations. This action taken by the public in the wake of the eruption makes it clear that the uncommon sense of interpretation of what has just occurred legitimated the ideas and values of Roman Catholic Church. Hegemonic consent by the majority was given values of the Roman Catholic Church. Hegemonic consent by the majority to a metaphysical, not scientific interpretation of the events. It's not suggested that Roman Catholic discourse was an unified system of ideas shared by all parties, who claim it as a position of identity in the national crisis. Hegemony depends on the apparent coherence of universality of maintains its legitimacy as common sense. Historical analysis Historical analysis of this particular event in Quito reveals an ambiguous application of universal acceptance Roman Catholic principles and ideals did not in fact exist. As a hegemonic discourse, the explanatory powers of Roman Catholics was no longer invisible and a mark on the legitimacy of a worldview based on Roman Catholic principles had been opened for debate by the new discourses of liberalism and science in Ecuador, just as the hegemony is constantly being made. It follows by the same reasons that it is constantly being unmade. The liberal government's official bulletin argued that the natural law was but used theological languages to suggest that God's anger had been directed to the highland landowners whose property had been ruined, and claimed its own religious faith. Representatives of the church recognized the growing power of natural scientific. Finally, the liberal government official bulletin said, argued for natural law, but used theological language to suggest that God's anger had been directed to the highland landowners, whose property had been ruined, and claimed its own religious faith. Thank you.